When you're improvising jazz solos, then most of the time you're going to be using eighth note lines. That's sort of the main subdivision that we use when we're improvising jazz. And even though you know how to play the changes, if you can use the arpeggios and hit all the right notes, it can be difficult to still get them to sound kind of fresh and inspired and not just a little bit heavy and boring. In this video, I'm going to go over a way of working that can really change up the rhythm and make your lines a lot more interesting to listen to. And it's actually quite easy to get into. If you start working like this when you're coming up with new lines, then you can also get it into your playing. My name is Jens Larsen. Learn jazz, make music. But just to have something to start with, here's a really
boring jazz line.
So this example actually uses the right notes. It's clearly spelling out a 2-5-1 in the key of F major. But the problem is that everything is kind of heavy. Everything is really emphasized on the beat and there's no interesting rhythm, there's no syncopation in there. So everything is just... And that kind of makes it heavy and a little bit boring to listen to. You can do stuff like this where you're emphasizing on the beat and driving to the next heavy beat sometimes, but you also want to change it up and make the lines a little bit more fresh, a little bit more surprising for the listener. Now, as an example of somebody who's really good at doing this, let's just take this pretty famous Charlie Parker line. There are two things that makes this line really interesting to listen to. The first thing is that he's playing the first arpeggio as a triplet. So we get the G minor 7 arpeggio like this. From here, he goes into these groups of 3 eighth notes where he's using chromaticism to point towards a note. So we get this pattern. And because it's 3 eighth note groups, then we have the accent, so the goal of these getting an accent, and it's shifting within our 4/4 meter. And that really makes that line a little bit more interesting to listen to. And that's what I'm going to focus on in this video, using groups of eighth notes to shift the accents a little bit, and in that way create some lines that have a more surprising flow than just from 1 to 3 and from 3 to 1 and so on and so forth. The easiest way to start working on this is probably to take a bar of eighth notes and then split that up into groups of 3 and 2 eighth notes. You can do this in several different ways. The one you probably want to start with is 3-3-2, because that's the most natural one that you probably already know from a 3-2 clave or from like a Bo Diddley groove. So the idea is to construct a lick where the melody really fits this 3 notes, 3 notes, and then 2 notes grouping. And an example of that could sound like this. So here I start with a G minor triad. Then I change the top note down from a D to a C and then play the same 2 notes. So that's a group of 3 notes and another one. And then a group of 2 notes, which is C and A. And then the rest is just a C7 line. And as you can see in the first example, then using a triad is a really nice way to have a 3-note melody that you can use as a 3-note grouping also. And if I use that a little bit more in an example, then that could sound something like this. So this is again on the G minor 7, and I'm first using the triad from the 3rd, and that's of course a B flat major triad, and then the triad from G minor itself, so we get first the B flat and then G minor, then I'm skipping up and then using C and A again, so, and then we get a C7 line. And I'm using descending triads because that's a little bit easier to get those to work as accents in this kind of line. So if you play a descending melody, then the first note will sort of by itself just get an accent and stand out a little bit more, and the whole thing will flow a little bit better. And of course, you don't always have to use 3-3-2. You can also change it up and go 3-2-3 or 2-3-3. And an example of a 3-2-3 line would be something like this. With this idea, then we're kind of still neatly staying within the bar, so everything is still gonna come clearly out on the 1 all the time. But actually you can use this, and you can also see in the Charlie Parker line, it's actually moving around where the 1 might appear to be in the line and it's being unclear. So that means that you can also do this and then cross the bar line. One way to start working with this is just to look at not 1 bar, but then 2 bars of 8 notes. So now we have 16 eighth notes, and we can split those up into groups of 3. And that means that we kind of have 5 groups of 3, and then we just have 1 extra note that we can use to resolve on the forehand. And this is a great way to sort of blur the bar lines a little bit and then make everything a little bit more unclear and create some tension in that way. And that can be a nice thing to have in there, especially if you're playing everything else, really sort of spelling out the changes. So here's an example of this where I'm using triads moving up through the scale, and then also just to change the sound, I've tried to use an altered dominant. The melodic idea here is that I'm playing descending triads and then I'm moving them through the scale. So I'm starting on the triad from the third of the chord, and that's a B flat major triad, and then I'm playing that descending, moving up through the scale. So the next one is a C major, up to D minor. And then here now I'm actually on the 1 of the C7 altered, but I'm not changing it because I'm first gonna change on the 1 and, where I go to a D flat minor and then an E flat minor triad on the C7 altered, and then resolving to the third of F major 7, which is an A. With this example, I'm still moving the melody around and changing triad every time, but since the whole point of this is actually that we have this rhythm that's 3 notes that's kind of shifting on top of the meter, then you can make that even more clear by just repeating the same phrase as much as you can, and then only change it whenever you really have to for the chord. And an example of that could sound like this. So the idea here is that I'm using sort of a pentatonic fragment, and I'm just playing G, F, and D, and then that means that I'm using that 3 times on the G minor 7, so. And then on the C7 altered, I kind of need to change this, so I just move it up a half step. And then finally also moving it up 1 more half step to fit it on an F major 7. And then end on the second note here to end on the 9th of the F major. Now that we're working with phrases over 2 bars and we have 16 8 notes that we can work with, we can also use larger groupings than 3 8 notes at a time. Probably the obvious choice to go for now will be 5 8 notes. And really we're going to be splitting the bar up, or the 2 bar phrase up, in 3 groups of 5 8 notes, and then we again have sort of 1 extra to resolve on the 4 and. This is a great grouping to work with. The way I'm using it here is actually that I'm playing it as a 2-3 grouping. So my 5 note grouping is first 2 8 notes and then 3 8 notes, and that gives me this pattern. And if I move that through the 2-5-1, then we get something like this. Of course, I'm only scratching the surface on a really huge topic with this video. And if you want to see more videos where I'm going to talk about and analyze different ways of using rhythms within 8-note lines, then leave a comment on this video, especially if you have some specific ideas on stuff you want me to cover, like triplet groupings or other kinds of subdivisions. If you want to check out some really great rhythmical, at least for the most part, rhythmical ideas, then check out this video where I'm analyzing 5 different ways that Charlie Parker is using arpeggios. There are some groupings ideas, there's also some triplet ideas, and there are actually just some really solid lines to check out and get into your own playing.